Script. Nobody wants to say it out loud yet, but something strange is happening behind the scenes in the NFL. One of the most powerful jobs in football is quietly becoming radioactive. Not because of money, not because of location, but because of one name. The Cleveland Browns are searching for a head coach, and on paper this should be attractive. Billion-dollar ownership, a desperate fan base, total control to reset the franchise. And yet, elite coaching candidates are hesitating. Some are stalling. Others, according to reports, aren't even making it past the early conversations. And it all comes back to one condition. Behind closed doors, the Browns aren't just asking coaches if they want the job. They're asking something much more specific. Are you willing to build this team around Shedeur Sanders? That question is quietly splitting the coaching market in half. This isn't about talent. Even critics admit the kid can play. The issue is everything that comes with it. The attention, the noise, the cameras that never leave, the constant headlines, and of course, the unavoidable shadow of his father, Deion Sanders, one of the most polarizing figures football has ever seen. For some coaches, that spotlight is an opportunity. For others, it's a career trap. Because if this works, you're a genius. But if it fails, you're not just fired, you're remembered, labeled, filed away as the coach who couldn't handle it. That fear is reshaping interviews. It's changing how questions are answered. And it's forcing coaches to decide whether they believe in development or just safe situations. And once you understand what the Browns are really demanding from their next head coach, you'll see why some of the biggest names in football would rather sit out an entire season than touch this job. Because this isn't just a coaching search anymore. It's a test of confidence. And not everyone is passing it. What makes this Browns coaching search different isn't the money, the roster, or even the pressure. It's the condition attached to the job, a condition that's quietly changing how coaches view Cleveland entirely. According to reports and league chatter, the Cleveland Browns aren't just interviewing coaches the usual way. They're not asking vague questions about philosophy or scheme. They're putting one requirement front and center. Whoever takes this job must commit to building around Shedeur Sanders as QB1. Let that sink in. In a league where head coaches usually demand control over the quarterback position, the Browns are flipping the power structure. This isn't a competition promise. It's not a we'll see how camp plays out situation. Coaches are being asked, up front, if they believe in Shedeur enough to stake their reputation on his development. That's rare, almost unheard of. Normally, a new head coach walks in with leverage. He gets to evaluate the roster, install his system, and decide who fits. Here, that decision is already made. And for some candidates, that's a deal breaker before football even enters the conversation. This doesn't mean coaches think Shedeur can't play. That's the part getting twisted publicly. The hesitation isn't about arm strength, mobility, or processing speed. It's about risk. Because committing to a young quarterback, especially one with non-stop media attention, means tying your career timeline to his growth. If he hits, you're a genius. If he struggles, you're the scapegoat. And coaches know how fast narratives turn in the NFL. This condition also signals something deeper about the Browns' internal dynamics. Ownership wants direction. The front office wants stability. And after years of quarterback chaos, they want a clear identity at the most important position on the field. That urgency is understandable, but it also narrows the pool dramatically. Only a certain type of coach says yes to that kind of setup. Someone confident enough to develop talent. Someone secure enough to handle noise. Someone willing to accept responsibility instead of deflecting it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The moment this condition is presented, it exposes everyone in the room. You instantly learn who believes in teaching quarterbacks and who prefers ready-made solutions. Because once you agree to that Arabic sheen, Arabic rot, Arabic talk, there's no hiding. No excuses, no easy exit. And that's exactly why this coaching search is already becoming one of the most revealing in recent NFL history. On the surface, the Cleveland Browns head coaching job looks like power and opportunity. Big market, loyal fan base, a roster with real talent on both sides of the ball. But once coaches start peeling back the layers, this job stops looking like a reset and starts looking like a minefield. The biggest issue is the quarterback mess, and there's no clean way around it. The Browns are still financially tied to Deshaun Watson, whose contract limits flexibility and forces uncomfortable decisions. Even if he's not the long-term answer on the field, his presence still looms over every roster move, every cap discussion, and every press conference. Any incoming head coach has to navigate that reality while trying to sell a clear vision to the locker room. Then there's the internal divide that's been quietly building. Reports suggest the front office and coaching staff haven't always been aligned when it comes to quarterback philosophy. Kevin Stefanski had his preferences, the front office had theirs, and now, whoever walks in next inherits that unresolved tension. That's not a clean slate, that's unfinished business. History doesn't help either. Cleveland's reputation around the league isn't based on patience or stability. Coaches know this. They've watched regime after regime get blamed for problems that existed long before they arrived. They've seen how quickly expectations turn into pressure and how fast pressure turns into scapegoating. And unlike other struggling franchises, the Browns don't just need one fix. This isn't a "we're a coach away" situation. The offensive identity is unclear. The leadership hierarchy in the locker room is unsettled. Even veteran stars haven't clearly stepped into the emotional leadership role teams usually rely on during turbulence. That means any new head coach isn't just installing a playbook. He's asked to stabilize the organization, align ownership and management, manage the media spotlight, and develop a young quarterback, all at the same time. And he's expected to show results immediately. That combination is what makes this job quietly toxic. Because if things go right, ownership gets credit for finally figuring it out. But if things go wrong, the coach becomes the face of failure, not the contract decisions, not the long-term missteps, the coach. Smart candidates see that risk clearly. They understand that this isn't just about football IQ, it's about political navigation, perception management, and surviving long enough to see a vision through. And that's why some coaches aren't rushing to say yes, not because they're afraid of Cleveland, but because they understand exactly how unforgiving this situation can be once the honeymoon ends. Here, where the conversation around the Cleveland Browns quietly shifts from football to something much messier. Because when people inside league circles talk about the so-called Shedeur problem, they're not really talking about throws, reads, or footwork. They're talking about perception. Almost everyone who's actually evaluated Shedeur Sanders agrees on the basics. The arm talent is real. The pocket awareness is there. The composure, especially for a young quarterback thrown into chaos, has shown up on tape. This isn't a debate about whether he belongs on an NFL field. The issue is everything surrounding him. There's the non-stop attention. Every snap is dissected. Every quote turns into a headline. Every mistake feels louder because the cameras never leave. And then there's the factor no one wants to pretend doesn't matter. His father, Deion Sanders. One of the most influential, outspoken, and polarizing figures football has ever produced. That combination creates a narrative coaches can't ignore. Fair or not, some around the league view Shedeur as more than a quarterback. They see a storyline, a spotlight that doesn't shut off, a situation where the coach isn't just developing a player, he's managing optics, public opinion, and constant external noise. And for risk-averse candidates, that's exhausting before it even starts. Here's the important distinction, though. This narrative isn't based on confirmed issues behind the scenes. There's no verified report of locker room problems. no proven evidence that Shedeur is uncoachable. What exists instead is assumption. Rumors suggest some coaches worry about being second-guessed publicly. Reports claim others don't want to answer weekly questions that have nothing to do with game planning. That's how narratives form in the NFL, quietly, informally, and often without hard proof. What makes this dangerous is how quickly perception can become reality. Once a quarterback is labeled complicated, that label sticks, even if the complications have nothing to do with football. And suddenly, coaches start convincing themselves the situation is harder than it actually is. The irony is that the league constantly talks about needing leaders, teachers, and developers. Yet the moment a young quarterback comes with pressure instead of comfort, some coaches hesitate. Not because they can't coach him, but because they don't want to coach around him. And that's the core of the Shedeur problem. It's not about whether he can play. It's about whether coaches believe they can control the narrative that comes with him. Because in today's NFL, perception isn't just part of the job. For some coaches, it's the job they're most afraid of. This is where the story shifts from public discussion to quiet resistance, the part happening behind closed doors, where nothing is said on record but everything is understood. Around the league, there's been growing buzz that some high-profile coaching names aren't exactly enthusiastic about the Cleveland Browns opening. Not publicly, of course. No one is turning down interviews on Twitter. No official statements. But according to reports and league chatter, there's a noticeable lack of urgency from certain elite candidates. And it's not hard to see why. Names like Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan keep coming up in hypothetical conversations, usually framed as what would it take scenarios, draft picks, control, long-term security. But those conversations feel more like media exercises than real pursuits. Rumors suggest that for coaches already established at the top of the profession, Cleveland doesn't represent upside, it represents exposure. Then there's Mike McDaniel, whose name has floated in speculative reporting. On paper, the fit makes sense. Quarterback-friendly system, modern offense, proven ability to elevate young talent. But reports claim there's skepticism from some league voices about whether his personality aligns with the situation Cleveland presents. Not his football mind, the environment. And that's the key distinction. This hesitation isn't being framed as we don't believe in the quarterback. It's being framed as we don't believe in the margin for error. Coaches at this level know how thin the line is between being called a genius and being labeled a failure. They understand that stepping into a job where the quarterback decision is already locked in and heavily scrutinized removes flexibility they're used to having. So instead of outright refusals, what you're hearing about is distance, delayed conversations, lukewarm interest, polite engagement without momentum, the kind of resistance that never makes headlines but absolutely shapes outcomes. And to be clear, this is still speculative. There's no confirmed list of coaches who have said no. But when multiple insiders hint at the same discomfort, patterns start to matter, especially in a league where coaches talk, agents talk, and perceptions spread fast. What's fascinating is how this quietly flips the power dynamic. Normally, teams chase elite coaches. Here, the Browns are effectively asking elite coaches to chase belief, to commit not just to a job, but to a quarterback-centric vision they didn't choose themselves. For some, that's a challenge worth taking. For others, it's a variable they'd rather avoid. And the silence from certain big names might be saying more than any press conference ever could. To understand why this situation matters so much, you have to understand how the NFL actually works, not the official rules, not what gets said at press conferences. The unwritten rules, the ones every coach and executive knows but rarely admits out loud. The NFL is a fraternity, a tight, overlapping circle of owners, general managers, agents, and coaches who all talk to each other constantly. Jobs don't just come from resumes, they come from reputation, from what people say about you when you're not in the room. And once a narrative sticks, it's incredibly hard to shake. That's why turning down a job like the Cleveland Browns opening isn't as simple as saying, it wasn't the right fit. If word gets around that a coach hesitated because of the quarterback situation, specifically Shedeur Sanders, that decision doesn't exist in a vacuum. Other owners hear it. Other front offices hear it. And suddenly, a new label starts forming. He only wants perfect situations. He doesn't want to develop a young QB. He needs everything lined up before he'll take a risk. In today's NFL, that's dangerous. Quarterback development is the defining skill for modern head coaches. Teams aren't just hearing play callers anymore, they're hearing teachers, builders, long-term bets. And if you become known as the guy who passed on a young quarterback because the situation felt complicated, that reputation can quietly follow you. Not officially, no blacklist, no memo sent around the league. But opportunities dry up. Because when the next opening comes, owners ask questions. Why didn't he take Cleveland? What scared him off? And whether it's fair or not, refusing a challenge can be interpreted as lacking confidence, as choosing comfort over growth. That's the irony here. Coaches are praised publicly for being selective, for waiting on the right opportunity. But privately, the league respects coaches who bet on themselves, who walk into messy situations and believe they can impose order. This is especially true with quarterbacks. If you're labeled as someone who won't commit to developing one unless everything is perfect, you're suddenly competing against candidates who will. Candidates who see chaos as leverage, not a threat. That's why this Browns situation carries league-wide implications. It's not just about Cleveland filling a vacancy. It's about how coaches are evaluated moving forward, about who's seen as adaptable versus who's seen as rigid, brave versus cautious. So when coaches hesitate here, they're not just weighing wins and losses. They're weighing how the decision will echo through future interviews, future shortlists, and future opportunities. And in a league where perception often matters as much as results, those echoes can be loud and lasting. This is the part of the conversation where everything starts to fall apart, because the logic stops lining up. On one hand, analysts keep insisting the Cleveland Browns need a hard ass, a no-nonsense leader, someone who won't coddle players, won't bend to noise, and won't let a young quarterback dictate the culture. The message is clear. Cleveland needs toughness, accountability, authority. But then, almost in the same breath, those same voices pivot. Suddenly, the discussion turns to whether the Browns should give up first-round draft picks to land an offensive mastermind. Names like Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan get floated. Coaches known not for drill sergeant energy, but for creativity, quarterback development, and player-friendly systems. Think about that contradiction for a second. You can't argue that modern players are too soft, too coddled, and desperately need hard coaching. Then turn around and say the solution is trading premium assets for a quarterback whisperer whose entire reputation is built on adapting to players. Those two ideas don't coexist. They're opposites. And the irony gets even sharper. The analysts praising toughness are also the ones arguing that Cleveland should sacrifice future draft capital to get the perfect coach. As if the Browns' problems can be solved by importing brilliance rather than building resilience. As if development only works when conditions are flawless. That logic ignores reality. Historically, when teams trade picks for elite coaches, it's because they believe they're one piece away. The comparison that keeps coming up is the John Gruden trade. Tampa believed they had everything except the right voice. They made a bold move, accepted the cost, and it paid off immediately. But here's the part people skip over. Cleveland isn't one piece away. This isn't a roster that just needs better play calling. It needs identity, leadership, stability, and most importantly, alignment. Trading picks for a coach doesn't magically erase internal fractures or external pressure. It just raises expectations while shrinking margin for error. So what's really happening here isn't a football debate. It's an exposure. The same people demanding toughness are afraid of uncertainty. They want a hard coach, but only if he comes with guarantees. They want accountability, but not risk. They want development, but only if it's already proven. And that's exactly the mindset they're accusing players of having. This contradiction reveals the uncomfortable truth. The Browns don't just need a leader of men on the field. They need one on the sideline and in the conversation surrounding the job. Someone willing to accept imperfection and build anyway. Because you can't demand toughness while chasing comfort. And you can't preach accountability while avoiding risk. At some point, someone has to pick a direction and live with it. This is where the conversation finally needs to slow down and get honest. Because when you strip away the noise, the narratives, and the hypotheticals, the tape tells a very different story. When you actually watch Shedeur Sanders, what jumps out isn't hype, it's composure. In his early NFL action, he didn't look overwhelmed. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look like someone drowning in the moment. He showed pocket awareness that can't be coached easily, subtle movements to avoid pressure, eyes staying downfield instead of bailing early, and a willingness to take hits to complete throws. Those are traits teams spend years searching for. Were there mistakes? Of course, he's a rookie. Timing wasn't perfect. Some throws sailed. A few reads came late, but none of those are red flags, they're developmental checkpoints. The kind every young quarterback hits when the game speeds up. What matters is how those mistakes happened. They weren't reckless. They weren't panicked. They weren't the product of confusion. They came from aggression and confidence, trying to make plays instead of avoiding them. That's the kind of problem coaches usually want to fix, because it means the foundation is already there. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The Browns won with him. Not because he was flawless, but because he managed the game, responded after mistakes, and kept the offense functional. That alone separates him from a long list of young quarterbacks who crumble once momentum turns. When you compare that to what Cleveland has dealt with recently, the contrast is noticeable. The offense didn't feel stuck. The pocket didn't feel static. There was movement, adaptability, and energy, things that don't always show up on a stat sheet but absolutely show up on film. This is why the idea that coaches are scared of the player doesn't really hold up. If anything, the tape suggests the opposite. It suggests a quarterback who's coachable, resilient, and capable of growth. Someone who hasn't been broken by chaos, which matters, given the environment he walked into. So when coaches hesitate, it raises an uncomfortable question. Are they reacting to what they see on film? Or what they imagine dealing with off it? Because film doesn't care about headlines. It doesn't care about last names or camera angles. It shows decision-making, mechanics, and response under pressure. And on those fronts, Shedeur didn't look like a liability. He looked like a project worth believing in. And that's what makes this moment so revealing. The tape offers possibility. Development, a real chance to shape a quarterback from the ground up. Coaches who see that feel intrigue. Coaches who aren't evaluating football, they're evaluating comfort. And in a league that claims to value development above all else, that difference matters more than anyone wants to admit. When you strip everything else away, this Browns job doesn't demand the smartest coach or the most creative coach. It demands the most secure one. The Cleveland Browns don't need a savior. They need someone who isn't shaken by noise, timelines, or perception. Someone who understands that real authority doesn't come from press conferences or play sheets. It comes from conviction. Because this situation will test a coach immediately. The quarterback is already chosen in Shedeur Sanders. The media spotlight is already locked in. The fan base is already divided. There's no easing into this job, no quiet first year to evaluate the roster. Whoever takes over walks straight into pressure, expectations, and constant scrutiny. That's why this job filters candidates so aggressively. The right coach here is someone who doesn't need universal approval. Someone comfortable being unpopular early if it means setting standards that last. Someone who can coach a young quarterback hard without turning it into a power struggle, and support him without feeding the narrative that he's being protected. That balance is rare. You can see why names like Brian Flores keep coming up in conversations. Not because he's perfect, but because he's shown he's willing to confront uncomfortable situations head-on. He doesn't run from conflict. He doesn't soften messages to protect optics. And he's already proven he's willing to risk reputation for belief. On the other end of the spectrum, coaches like Mike McDaniel represent a different kind of fit. One built on communication, trust, and quarterback development. That path requires emotional intelligence, patience, and the ability to tune out external chatter entirely. Both approaches can work. What won't work is indecision. This job will expose any coach who needs perfect alignment, full control, or instant buy-in. If you're constantly worried about how things look, you won't survive how they feel. If you're afraid of being tied to a young quarterback's growing pains, you'll never earn his trust or the locker room. The Browns don't need a coach chasing legacy or safety. They need one chasing impact. Someone who sees Shedeur not as baggage, but as responsibility. Someone who understands that development isn't clean, linear, or quiet. Because the truth is, every rebuild is uncomfortable. Every quarterback worth developing comes with questions. The only difference here is that Cleveland's questions are louder. The coach who thrives in this role won't try to silence that noise. He'll ignore it and build anyway. And the moment someone with that mindset walks into the building, this stops being a toxic job and starts being an opportunity everyone else will wish they'd taken. When everything is stripped down to its core, this story isn't really about the Cleveland Browns. It's about belief, about confidence, about who in the NFL actually trusts their ability to build something when the conditions aren't perfect. For weeks, the conversation has been framed as coaches avoiding a situation, as if hesitation automatically means wisdom. But there's another way to look at it, one that doesn't get nearly as much attention. What if the coaches backing away aren't being careful, but exposed? Because in a league where adversity is unavoidable, running from complexity sends a message. It says you're comfortable teaching when the room is quiet. It says you're confident when the quarterback is already polished. And it says you're willing to lead, as long as someone else takes the risk first. That's why this moment matters for Shedeur Sanders. If coaches truly believed he was a lost cause, the story would be simple. No intrigue, no debate, but that's not what's happening. What's happening is hesitation rooted in pressure, optics, and fear of being tied to a long-term project in public. And that distinction changes everything. Because quarterbacks don't develop in silence. They develop through mistakes, scrutiny, and resilience. The same things coaches claim they want players to embrace. Yet when faced with that exact challenge, some coaches blink. And maybe that's the real filter at work here. This situation is forcing coaches to reveal who they are before they ever step into the building. Are you the type who needs control and comfort? Or are you the type who believes teaching, leadership, and structure can overcome noise? From Shedeur's perspective, that clarity might actually be a gift. The coaches who hesitate are telling you something important about themselves. And the coach who eventually says yes, without conditions, without fear, without excuses, is likely the one who genuinely believes in development rather than just talking about it. So when people ask whether this situation hurts Shedeur's future, they may be asking the wrong question. Maybe this moment doesn't damage his path at all. Maybe it sharpens it. Maybe it ensures that whoever ends up leading him isn't doing it reluctantly, or because there were no better options, but because they want the challenge. Because in the NFL, the most dangerous thing isn't pressure. It's doubt. And the coach who thrives in Cleveland won't be the one who ignored that pressure. It'll be the one who looked straight at it and said, "That's exactly why I'm here." So here's the question that lingers long after the interviews end. Does this situation make you question the quarterback? Or does it make you question the coaches who weren't brave enough to take him on? Because history has a funny way of rewarding the people who bet on belief, while everyone else explains why they didn't.